thank you very much to Professor Liu for such a very, definitely a very dense presentation with a lot of information, but very well presented, as well as very detailed. Especially, I really like the way you described the Harvard CCD study step by step and showing us the graphs and also showing us how important to understand and to be patient in studies of this, importance, right? So maybe I can do a very quick recap, and please do, correct me if I'm wrong in my recap of your presentation, Professor Liu, on this. Sure. So it sounds like it all started, well, of course, on 60 Minutes Plus when it was brought up on, nationwide, television in the US in 2007 in October about this issue, right, of definitely the presence of the colony collapse disorder, right, where we need to understand that the importance of bees basically in the ecological system, right? And Professor Liu basically pointed out to us the basics of how a healthy colony or a healthy hive exists, right? That the importance of bees to pollinate over 100 different crops. We will not get the diverse kind of the diversity of food that we're having now unless we have bees. And that's being very much established early in this presentation. And then Professor Liu moved on to tell us that then we need to address the issue of the disappearing bees, which we hear about all the time also in popular media. And there is a UN report published in 2011 about this issue. But what is disappointing about the UN report is how they only ask us to change human behavior without naming exactly what we need to change, which I will come back to that and ask actually Professor Liu, what exactly do we need to do? After hearing your presentation, what do we need to change actually in our behavior as humans? After hearing about your presentation, of course, for myself, I really want to learn more about what we can do to be responsible human beings in living on this planet as well. Now, what Professor Liu really spent a lot of time describing to us is the Harvard CCD study one, that basically how if we stopped in the first 2 weeks and stopped studying about the hives, the presence of how many hives are still remaining, then we basically will lose all the results because the results started coming in week 14 and then week 16 and then week 18 all the way down where 15 out of 16 hives basically are not functioning by the end of it, collapsed by the end of it, right? Which also points to the notion that neonicotinoid, which now I know how to pronounce, is actually the, the culprit basically to what is happening around us, right? Because of the common usage of this pesticide in our normal daily food, like corn. Or I remember you saying something around soy as well, if I hear it correctly, which I was quite surprised also, because with corn, of course, and soy is also one of these highly genetically modified product right now, right? That you hear all the time as a food item, right? So there's also Professor Liu also pointed out the two things that we need to really remember: the two terms, transgenerational, as well as sub-lethal exposure, right? The two that we need to understand in this study as well, because we're really talking about generations that is affecting, generation of bees that are affecting, right? And I really like the way that Professor Liu was talking about the idea of dosage and time. So earlier, a lot of people talk about, of course, the toxicity will increase if you increase the dosage, but it's actually the exposure, the length of time that you're exposed to this toxic that you can have a better understanding and a better formula of how it's affecting beehives and bee colonies in general. And that at the end of this presentation, Professor Liu introduced the precautionary principle, and which I want to also ask Professor Liu about that. What should we be precautioning ourselves against? Of course, we also have that need to learn about that. So there are two, maybe I can start off with two simple questions first. The first one is asking for Professor Liu's insights on why is the UN so reluctant to talking about exactly what kind of human behavior should we change, right? In order to, it's probably impossible to reverse the situation, but at least to lessen the harm of, of CCD, of course. And the second question I might have is, are there any alternatives actually to neonicotinoid? If we eliminate this, neonicotinoid from this formula, are there potential alternatives to helping the situation, or are we done? Is that nothing that could be probably as cheap or popular as neonicotinoid right now? Yeah, maybe we'll start with these two questions, and then we'll open the floor to the rest of the participants.
In fact, right after we published our first paper in 2012, the European Union actually they decided to re-examine the safety of neonicotinoid to honeybees, because in the Constitution of European Union there is a clause of precautionary principles. This clause actually mandates the EU government to look into possible cause to any ecological or human health disaster, as long as there are some data in the scientific literatures that point to the causal relationship. So EU actually used studies, including ours, to re-examine the neonicotinoid, and guess what? They banned those pesticides for 2 years of uses. The three most commonly used neonicotinoid in EU for 2 years. And during that 2-year period, EU actually did a study by themselves by looking into the pre and the post ban of those three pesticides and on the mortality of honeybee colony over winter within the 17 membership within EU. So not every country participate, but 17 out of the 27 participate in this bee study. And just 1 year, the result was shocking. Most of the countries, their beehive were much, much safer over winter as a result of the neonicotinoid ban in EU. So instead of a 2-year, the ban actually will become indefinite in EU. So those three pesticides those three neonicotinoids cannot be used in EU. Obviously, the pesticide manufacturer took the EU government to the court to challenge on their decision, but the precaution principle was in their constitution, and the result was very, very obvious and significant. So the ban is still in place in EU, but that's probably the only place in the world that actually banned neonicotinoid. The rest of the world, in terms of United States, China, and Japan, and so on and so forth, there's still no limitation on neonicotinoid use. And what was your second question? Alternative?
Yeah.
Well, for my 30+ years in pesticide research, I never call for a ban of certain pesticides. I believe that in modern agriculture perspective, pesticide is one of the necessities. But I call for the reasonable, careful usage of pesticides. We should not use pesticide as a prevention manner. We should use pesticide as a therapeutic manner, just like people taking antibiotics. You don't take antibiotics for prevention, right? But now this is really not exactly what I thought. After this initial honeybee study with neonicotinoid, I changed my position. I believe that neonicotinoid should be banned, in part because of the systemic natures. Again, a seed treated with, doesn't matter which kind of a seed treated with neonicotinoid By the time the plant grow to the stage that can have pollens, they can have nectars, those pollen will come out to the environment and then will be carried over to the certain stage, will be affecting the nearby organism. They will be affecting human if you inhale those pollens, right? And then the corn, the cucumbers, the tomatoes, everything that grow from the neonicotinoid tree seed would have a little bit of residue in the fruit. So this is really beyond plant protection. This is become the problem of public health, because everybody eating those vegetables and fruit. And now we understand a little bit of neonicotinoid could damage the very important organic, which is mitochondria. How could you that those pesticides still being used in agriculture? So neonicotinoid present a very challenging aspect to public health that other type of pesticides would never have this kind of a challenge. And that's why we need to ban neonicotinoid. We need to ban all the systemic pesticides. Let's go back to the older pesticides, which we have a better management measures. We know how to prevent those risks. But neonicotinoid, we cannot prevent the risk because it will come out as part of the pollen or nectar. I think that's my answer to your questions.
Thank you.
So that's ban neonicotinoid, just European Union.
Only European Union.
Yeah, at this moment.
So let's see if anyone else wants to ask a question. Feel free to jump in. Or you can also ask the question in the chat box as well. Let me see. Right now we do have a few questions in the chat box. From my colleague, actually, Kinchi, saying that could Professor Liu please tell us how the mainstream media responded to your research? In particular, how did the pesticide companies respond?
Well, obviously, pesticide manufacturers respond very negatively. I could use harass in a way that they will come after me. I mean, there are multiple professors from the so-called extension universities, like Michigan State, like Pennsylvania State University. There are a couple, they call themselves commercial beekeepers, but if you Google those people, they're actually part of the pesticide manufacturer companies. But those negative response to our research doesn't really matter because there are always positive responses. For example, there are a couple of documentaries that actually follow our studies to sort of like broadcasting what's going on right now in the health of the honeybees and what will be the major culprit to the survival of honeybees. There are very numerous positive documentary of our study. The Boston Globe, which is the mainstream newspaper in the Boston or the New England area, they actually did a small study and they published on a Sunday paper to document how we come up with a study, how we did a study and what was the result of the study and what would be the consequence as part of our study. So I would say that yes, there are negative responses, but for people like me doing those pesticide research, either damage to human health or ecological health, you're gonna run into those negative responses from the manufacturers, right? That's quite obvious. This is one estimation was 16 billion annual sale of neonicotinoid. Now, Professor Liu himself is going to stop this $16 billion sales. I mean, how could they come up with a response nicely and positively? So I took that. But I also believe that this is quite important because, as I mentioned, that I never called for the ban of any pesticides. But understand what we did, understand the outcome of what's going on right now in the environment. There's no place for neonicotinoid to be exist in the society, just because once you put down pesticide in the soil or coat the seed with neonicotinoid, you have no control where those neonicotinoids are going to go, and most likely end up in people's lunch or dinner table.
Thank you. It is quite disheartening to hear that it will end up on your lunch and on your dinner table, but it seems like it's just very real this way to put it. There's no word to put it other than that way. So there's another question from audience watching live streaming in China. When we set environmental policies, there are some minimum standards for certain substances. Do you think this is an effective control given the cumulative effect over the long term? Perhaps we should prohibit their use completely.
Well, I mean, the pesticide regulation itself is quite outdated because we were not set up to examine pesticide at the very, very low level has this transgenerational effect. Also, the endpoint is something that actually deep inside the mitochondrial DNA. So we are not set up for that. And that's why we need to have more and more research to look into this. But according to a research that published much, much earlier by a group of German scientists, they actually come up with this model suggesting that chemicals like neonicotinoid that can carry so long, and then because of the low level exposure, but long period of exposures, there is no safety, there's no minimum safety standards for those type of chemicals, not just pesticide, but other chemical as well. So I look at their model, I look at their studies, and I look at our neonicotinoid research. I think neonicotinoid qualify or should be categorized into the group that has no minimum safety, because you can carry over generation down the road, right? So that's why this neonicotinoid give us an opportunity if the government willing to do that. That's revolutionize those regulation bodies. Let's look at individual toxic chemical in a very public health relevant matters. Let's give up this acute high level exposures. Let's focus on sublethal over long period of time exposures. And let's look at the endpoint, or we call it health biomarker, whatever you call it, okay? It's more relevant to human health. And let's be serious about keeping those good chemicals in the market for people use. But let's remove those chemicals that are very hazardous because low level exposure, long period exposures.
I think there is another question again from the audience in China. In China, where genetic transformed crops, I suppose it's GMO crops, are not widespread, we also have the problem of significant decline in insects. Can it be said that relative to the issue of pesticide, other factors like climate, disaster, urbanized light pollution could be more important?
I would say yes. It doesn't have to be planting GMO crops that could lead to significant neonicotinoid exposure to the environment. Keep in mind that neonicotinoid use is worldwide. It's very popular. In fact, China used tons of those neonicotinoids in different part of agriculture. As I showed you in one of the slides, you can buy a bag of neonicotinoids treated seed, the corn seed in Taobao Wang, right? So that kind of tells you that doesn't have to be GMO. In fact, most of the conventional seed right now in China, they all coated with neonicotinoid because the seed company like to do that. They can generate more cash flow by coating seed with pesticides. This is my standing here. You don't even know that this corn seed planted in the soil, whether this corn would grow healthy or has disease. You don't even know that, but you put pesticide on the seed in the very prevention manners, right? It's just like a young baby just born, you gave the young baby a dosage of antibiotic every day because you expect the baby got sick. But what if the baby never got sick? And then one day the baby really sick and need antibiotics because the drug resistance, we cannot save the babies, right? So this is a very simple concept. The seed coated with neonicotinoid is absolutely a wrong approach because you are using pesticide as a prevention chemical, not a therapeutic chemical. This is totally against why we have pesticides.
I think Professor Lu also raised the question between the relation between the science and also ethics. So could you elaborate more?
I think the science and ethics should be there when we examine a new chemical that's about to be manufactured and bring to the market. But the science and ethics will quickly wash down because the political bureaucracies. Not many scientists were involved in the process from the beginning to the end. There's a lot of backdoor lobbying. There's a tons of conflict of interest. There's a lot of cover up. Let me put it this way. I think this statement is true as well. All the pesticides that eventually got banned not because of the toxicity that we were informed, either by the manufacturer or by the government. Those pesticides that got banned eventually were because the toxicity that we were not told or not informed. But later we found out that that's the case. For example, this is probably the hottest pesticide issue in the United States is the glyphosate. I don't know how many people follow this litigation case of glyphosate. 20 years ago or 25 years ago, when Monsanto was about to launch glyphosate, this wonderful herbicide, what they call, they say this is the safest herbicide to the environment. This is the safest herbicide to the human health. 25 years later, there was the first litigation case got announced by the court in California. A gentleman who sprayed glyphosate throughout his career life working for the school district. He was diagnosed as non-Hodgkin lymphoma cancer a couple years ago. His case was brought into the court in 2019. Guess what? He was awarded close to $3 million US as a damage. But think about this. We use glyphosate for 25 years. The environment absorbed glyphosate for 25 years. 25 years later, we know that glyphosate caused cancers. 25 years ago, we didn't know. So where is the science? Where is the ethics?
Could you say something about your existing or ongoing research?
We are continuing this line of research in terms of looking into mitochondrial DNA damage to different organisms who all have the opportunity to be exposed in the environment. We also interested in this transgenerational effect to the great extent because, I mean, if we can prove that just what the German scientists said in 1960s, that the time and exposure determine the dosage, doesn't have to be just the dose itself. So if we can identify the transgenerational toxicities, either in organisms like bees or in humans, then obviously we have to look into this in the future toxicological regulations. We should apply this to all the chemicals that human has the opportunity to be exposed to, and then to see whether those pesticides or chemical to the extent that should be used by humans in the society, because again, there's no safety levels. I mean, sooner or later, the toxicity will show up. If not in this generation, will be in the following generations.
From Alice, is Taiwan more like the EU or the US in terms of pesticide use?
As far I know a little bit of the Taiwan regulations, my answer would be more like US, not EU. As I mentioned that, as far as I know, only EU and one province in Canada, which is Ontario. Ontario has tried to implement the strict use of neonicotinoid a couple years ago. I don't know the outcome, but they already have the implementation. So not the whole Canada, but the province of Ontario has similar regulation that EU lay out in 2013. But that's the only two political bodies in the world that I know that restrict or limited use of neonicotinoid. There's no third political body that has this type of regulations.
One more last question. What's your opinion? Maybe this is the last question. What's your opinion on genetically modified food? That's very
well, I mean, we can talk about this beyond pesticide, okay? My position is to this GMO food. It's just like a company trying to sell you iPhone or any type of consumer product. It is a consumer product. There's no ingredient of keep people from hunger. There's impossible to increase agricultural productions and so on and so forth. It is just a commercial product. So let's not place GMO as a wonderful drug to overcome the human hunger and so on and so forth. That's completely BS. Okay, it's just a consumer product. It depends upon whether you're gonna buy into it or not. I personally wouldn't buy into it. What's wrong with the conventional food? You have to answer this question, okay? If there's something wrong with the conventional seed or conventional food, then we probably think about GMO. But there's nothing wrong with the conventional crop. Why we move into the GMO industry? Well, because they need to make money. That's it.